Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, all the panelists. My name is Jamil, Chade. I'm a journalist from Brazil, based here at the UN. Since we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to go right away to the panel. And my first question is basically, I'll go around. You actually need to know you're being very privileged because together, all these people together in the same panel, it's really something really extraordinary, and I fully congratulate the organizers. My question, and perhaps if we start with Ms. Lute, this film was done in 2006. Has a lot changed since then? Has the UN changed the behavior, or at least the way it sees the problem?
How many of you have ever had someone ask you the question, where will you be 10 years from now? Yeah? Maybe everybody. 10 years ago, I was at the UN, appointed lead in peacekeeping to implement the response to the allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse. If you asked me 10 years ago whether I would be sitting here today addressing this same abhorrent behavior, I would have said, no way. Surely we can put in place the kinds of things that will prevent this from happening. What's happened in 10 years in the UN? The conduct and discipline units that were spoken about in the film, we created 12 years ago. The certification that member states provide to the UN about the suitability of senior leadership is in place. The numbers that you see again and again and again in the Secretary General's reports about allocations, about cases, increasingly now naming units and countries of origin, didn't exist 12 years ago. Monsieur Boguet, who you saw in the film, is still in jail. He was awaiting trial 12 years ago when this film was made. He's still in jail, I think. Yeah, he's still in jail. Tried, convicted, and still in jail. So some things have changed. I was appointed 2 weeks ago to coordinate on behalf of the Secretary General a number of initiatives across the system. My colleagues and I, some of whom are in this room, have asked 3 questions. Why does this continue to happen? Why does this continue to happen? Is it because people don't know that you shouldn't rape children? Is it because people don't care if they rape children? Is it because somehow people think when you come into the UN there are different rules? No, none of those things are okay. And what we know, and as we've begun our work on the coordination front, is that the danger for abuse is ever present. It's ever present. We talk about it as anomalous behavior. There's not a family on the planet. There's not a school on the planet. There's not a workplace on the planet. There's not a city or a country or a church or an organization on the planet that has not had this problem. But we in the UN, when we address it, therefore, we have to recognize that the danger is ever present. And we have to elevate our efforts to prevent it to the level of a mission mandate with visible and accountability. People say the whole world is watching. The whole world must watch.
Thank you very much. Just for the first round of questions, Bea Edwards, you're the International Program Director of Government Accountability Project. we heard the word conspiracy of silence here. How much is this a challenge still today?
I think it's still a challenge. It is as serious a challenge as it was when the movie was made. My organization represented Anders Campos in the United States, and he was the third most senior official at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. When he saw a report from the Central African Republic that children had been sodomized and raped by non-UN peacekeepers under Security Council mandate, he went through the French mission to the French police and reported the evidence. And for doing that, the High Commissioner of Human Rights told him to resign, and when he would not resign, he was put on administrative leave and marched out of his office. His phone was taken, his keys were taken, his office became a crime scene. And only with the UN Dispute Tribunal deciding the case 4 weeks later was that suspension lifted. He was under investigation until early January of this year. As far as we know, no one who was guilty of those rapes or sodomy was investigated or charged or disciplined in any way. And we represent a number of peacekeepers, and we find that the remark Kofi Annan made is very true. The problem is people are afraid to disclose. And when you talk about measures that are taken, like conduct and discipline units, since we know from working with whistleblowers and from working with people who make disclosures like this, when there is a visible case that's covered in the press and that person is subject to retaliation the way Campos was, everybody else who might have done what he did either shuts down or leaves. So in the wake of the way the High Commissioner himself, who is still in place and undisciplined, in the wake of the way he handled that case, I think we will see more silence.
Thank you. Paula Donovan, you're the co-director of AIDS Free World and the Blue Code campaign. One number that we heard here, at least what someone at the movie or the film said, was that it could have reached 2,000 cases in that country, at least in that situation. The official report of the UN says 69 cases worldwide, if I'm not wrong. Why is it so difficult to know what is the actual dimension of this problem today?
Lack of transparency is the most serious problem that prevents the kind of progress that I wish I had seen over the last 12 years, but I have to respectfully disagree with you. I think that the world is beset by sexual exploitation and abuse. That's absolutely a given. The United Nations is held to a higher standard, and when we actually appoint and pay various people to fulfill the collective will of the United States, of the United Nations, then we expect them to follow the rules, and we expect them not to violate the human rights that the United Nations is constantly championing, and we certainly expect them to be prosecuted and investigated and prosecuted whenever that's appropriate. And instead, the UN operates under a shroud of silence. I mean, it's just a rare coincidence that we're sitting in this room talking about this phenomenon, and we're seeing the photograph of one man. I've never seen the photograph of any of the other hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of perpetrators who've been accused and found to be credibly guilty of these crimes, and in some cases, I suppose, they've been tried and convicted and sent to jail, but there's no information about that whatsoever. Not for us, the general public, and not for the victims, which is the most horrendous part. So the numbers are very deceiving, Jamil. That 69 in 2015 is 69 allegations, but in the sort of spirit of a lack of transparency, the United Nations uses this funny unit of measurement called allegations, but 69 allegations in 2015 meant 76 victims. So those are actually case loads, 69 case loads, and it meant 89 perpetrators. So when the Secretary General came out last Friday, I guess it was, or a week ago Friday, and said that there had been 69 allegations in 2015, what he wasn't saying is there were 89 perpetrators in 2015. And he didn't bring us up to date either. In the past 2 months alone, there have been 25 allegations, and that represents 31 victims and 47 perpetrators just in the months of January and February of 2016. So I just don't see the success that others in the United Nations feel has happened in the last 12 years.
Thank you. Madeleine, Rees, you were the head of OHCHR in Bosnia. We heard in the film that, of course, the UN is not a country. In your experience, how do you deal, basically, with the countries that actually send these soldiers? And what was the difficulty in having a dialogue, basically, to establish that this code would be implemented?
That's a short question.
Sorry.
I'll try and answer all that in just the 2 minutes. I think that what's been said so far actually is very reflective of exactly those problems, because, Jane, you're absolutely right, that the United Nations does not operate in a vacuum. It is reflective of certain values that come from and stem from our own societies. And what you were talking about is, in fact, no more and no less than the political economy of violence. It's all about structures of power, who has it, who doesn't have it. That is really reflected when peacekeepers or other troops go into places where there are inherent vulnerabilities as a result of conflict, with money, with prestige, with power. And the ability to abuse that power is legion, without there being effective control. What we have in place and had in place in Bosnia is similar to what we have now, which is now being strengthened by the new Security Council resolution. And that was essentially, it is entirely the responsibility of the sending state to take active measures against those who would or are committing violations. The big problem is, that's a great theory, but you've got your crime being committed in somebody else's country against victims in that country by people from a third country, and then you've got to get the evidence, get the people, get them back, provide the transparency of the actual hearing, if there's going to be a hearing, and then you've got to report back what happened, all of which takes a very long time, and in real life, just does not happen. Just does not happen. And all the violations that went on in Bosnia, not one person was sent home, and he was actually the good guy who was trying to help women by buying their freedom. Nobody else got sent home, or if they were, it wasn't for having done bad things, it was for having missing their wives. I mean, we saw the records of what happened. So in fact, you know, what we've got is a problem of troop contributing countries not taking responsibility, getting a huge amount of money from the United Nations for contributing those troops, and then the United Nations being so afraid of not having those troops that will actually not do the right thing by preventing those troops coming unless and until they can actually comply with the rule of law. And this is where we are at the moment, and I'm really hoping that Jane's going to take us further into exactly what can happen and should happen to make sure that there is accountability. And just in case I don't get a second chance at this, I want to put forward one proposal, and that is that all of us, if we commit crimes, we would expect to see the place where we're going to be arrested, detained, and then put on trial. We'd expect that. That's normal rule of law. Doesn't happen in a country that's in conflict. It's this sending back to country A, where you're from, and then never heard of again. What if we set up those tribunals so the guys who come, they see exactly where they're going to be put on trial if they break the law? You see it, you know it's serious, and suddenly it becomes something that puts you back in your box of control. Now, I think that would make sense. It would help all of us. And when you say, Jane, that the world should be watching, invite us to watch. Let the civil society, let all of us be part of the process in cleaning up the United Nations. Peacekeepers are what we have. We need them. But we don't need the ones that we've got right now without the form of discipline that is necessary.
Jane.
I thought I just did invite you.
Exactly.
I thought I just did. So I have enormous respect for my colleagues on the stage. I think it's important to hear what we're saying and not what we're not. I didn't use the word success. I wouldn't say we're operating from a position of success right now. We've got a problem on our hands. We have to deal with it in a pragmatic way, in large numbers, in an environment where this kind of behavior is accepted in every society. And we can do better than that. We have to do better. The world should be watching us in the UN. More is expected of us. There's no question about it. And my charge on behalf of the Secretary General is to coordinate the efforts to see that if we put a plan in place, why do we think this plan will make a difference? And how will people know things are better? How will we know? What do we need to see to know that things are better? And how can we point to that? I'm not going to make grandiose promises in this environment. I was a soldier myself for a very long time. I don't need anyone to explain to me what can happen to women in military environments. It's unacceptable. It's not just women. It happens to other men. It happens to vulnerable populations especially. And when I say this danger is ever present, we need to recognize that. We have told contingents in the past, I've done it myself, your services are no longer required, and we are prepared to do without your services if you are not prepared to live up to the standards of the UN. The Security Council resolution that was passed yesterday codifies that in a very strong way. We talk about accountability. I had a conversation with member states over the past couple of weeks, some of which are extremely concerned about the sovereign prerogatives of member states, particularly when it comes to control over their forces. I said, I'm actually really very glad to hear that, because you will have received by now a note from my office asking for all of you to provide us, please, with the rules and regulations that govern your militaries, because we would like to make them public. So we've asked all of the member states to provide us with the rules and regulations that they have in place that govern their militaries wherever they are, whatever they're doing, because we know they still operate when they're in peacekeeping. Give them to us. We'll publish those so everyone can see what those rules are. None of them have rules against courts-martial in situ, for example. There's no reason units cannot conduct courts-martial right in the circumstances of war deployment. Any commander who has ever been a commander knows how to mete out the justice and discipline that's provided for in their rules and regulations. We want to make that more transparent, and we want to close the gap on accountability when bad things happen, to bring member states and their sovereign authorities into play.
I don't know if you still need to leave at 10 o'clock. Fantastic, fantastic. So we can profit from your presence. Did you want to comment on this?
I did. I think that it is certainly encouraging to see that there is a continuing effort at the United Nations to address this problem. I think it was yesterday, maybe it was the day before, I'm a little bit confused about the days, but the Secretary General made a statement to the public about how ashamed and embarrassed he is by the continuing problems of sexual abuse. What remains puzzling is, here is the Secretary General. He has been in office for 9 years, almost 10, and there are people who propose solutions. There are legal solutions. The troop contributing countries must have a system for prosecution, repatriation of offending troops. The whole troop, as the U.S. resolution said yesterday, might be an effective way to deal with this. But there's absolutely, over 9 years, no really revealing research about the question Jane just asked. Why does this happen? And looking at the film, it's clear the detectives who've been walking around in the camps, they know some surprising things. They know why girl children are attractive. They don't have AIDS. People not in that situation don't know that. If I were going to try to address this, I would get a team of 2 anthropologists familiar with the region to go into each camp and stay there for 6 months and come out with a set of recommendations about the motivations and the inclinations and the fears and the consequences of sexual abuse. And it could be done quietly. It doesn't need to be a great public show, but there's no information. And the fact that we have no information is in itself an indictment of the United Nations. We don't even know the dimensions of the problem.
So it's not the case that we have no information. We don't like the level of information that we have. And there can always be more, point one. Point two, when I ask, and my colleagues collectively, when we ask, why does this continue to happen? We have statements from the Secretary General. Statements are not enough, we know that. I mean, those of us who have operated and been operationally responsible for what your organizations do or fail to do, we know that statements are not enough. You need to look at the incentive structures. You need to put rules in place. I mean, some of this behavior can be anticipated, as the film said. As you mentioned, we've got this environment of gross power imbalances that people are taking advantage of under the very noses of commanders and officials who are in charge of them. Why does that happen without action? So when we're also been the beneficiaries of a number of very generous offers of assistance, of insights, of research that exist. And what we're looking for are the pragmatic, hard-edged sets of recommendations that elevate the standards. As the film said itself, many, many units deploy with no issues whatsoever. What are they getting right? And what do we need to understand more about what they're doing right to correct the ones who are doing wrong?
Madeleine, basically, what are they doing right? What are these units doing right that they have no cases?
Well, just complying with the law, some would say.
Yes, but what are the incentives to comply with the law?
It's the disincentives that aren't there. That's the problem. Because essentially, when I'm looking at how the military are supposed to operate, if they can lock you up for not having shiny shoes, then they should be able to control what you do when it comes to sexually abusing children. We're not there. And I think there's a huge problem, a disconnect between what should be happening and all the rules and regulations, of which there are many, but as one of the guys in Bosnia said to me, nobody reads them, nobody cares about them until somebody actually confronts you with them because you've done something wrong, and then you start worrying about it. But I think the bigger problem is, yes, there can be rules and regulations. Now there is the new Security Council resolution, which has to be rolled out. Some very high bars have been put in place. Widespread and systematic abuse will lead to certain consequences. That's a very high bar. But despite all that, we've got to think, what is it within the culture of the United Nations which is facilitating this? So where some parts it does work, other parts it's not working. And then the big problem we have is the unaddressed question of those people who do identify it and do the right thing and do blow the whistle or just do their job, as Anders Campus was, or as I was, or as Kathy Bolkevats was. We're the ones who end up on the wrong side of the United Nations. We're the ones who end up who are disciplined, put before tribunals, and then basically set up as an example of what happens if, in fact, you go against the system, because the system, the institution, is too important to challenge. That, I think, is the biggest problem we've got within the United Nations system. Instead of embracing the people who will actually come forward and say, look, we've got a problem here, this is what we need to do, a lot of it is about working with those who are survivors of and giving them the space to talk, so you can then take that up the chain of command, knowing that you have the protection and support of that. Instead of that, you get the opposite. And until that is dealt with, until we get rid of this culture of protect the system at all times, then we will not get the change, and we will still have contingents who will continue to abuse children.
Paula?
I couldn't agree with you more, Madeleine, and that culture starts at the top. I mean, there are two tendencies in this issue, that both of which are wrong. One is to make everything the fault of the troop contributing countries or the police contributing countries. On average, 30% of all the allegations, and I use that word advisedly, I know that it doesn't represent victims and it doesn't represent perpetrators, it's a much smaller number, but 30% of that aggregate number of allegations is made against civilian United Nations staff members. Now, talking about being the gold standard, the people who are supposed to not only set the standard, but also preach it. So the people who are handing out these guidelines to the troop contributing countries when they arrive on a mission, you know, what are the rules, what are the regulations, what does the United Nations expect of you, the people who are training the troop contributing countries and their soldiers and police officers, the people who are accepting the reports first when someone walks onto a base and says, I or my child was raped last night, the person who's accepting that report on behalf of the United Nations, these are staff members, and there wasn't a word in the resolution that was passed yesterday. Was it yesterday? Friday. There wasn't a word about the civilians. So we're basically ignoring 1/3, and a critically important 1/3 of the problem, which is the UN civilians, the people who report, as you do, Jane, to the Secretary General. And those are people who are getting away scot-free. Nobody knows what happens to someone who, especially, except sort of administrative disciplinary measures that are taken against somebody who sexually exploits or abuses someone. People within the United Nations have no idea what the difference is between sexually abusing a child and being accused of sexual activity with a child. Nobody knows what the difference is between sexual exploitation that's absolutely against the rules and sexual exploitation or sexual relationships that is discouraged. So within the United Nations, there are no clear rules. It would be nice for the UN itself to hand over those sort of what are your rules, what are your regulations, what are your policies and procedures, what are your protocols when people are accused of these crimes, and what are the standards that have to be met. But that just doesn't happen. The leadership, the failure of leadership within the whole United Nations system is appalling. And one really clear example is that the Secretary General last year made a very public firing for the first time that I can ever recall, probably the first time in history. His head of mission in a peacekeeping country, the Central African Republic, was asked to step down. He was asked to resign because he wasn't up to the job. And that man, whose name is Boubacar Guy, had been the head of mission in the Central African Republic for the 11 months of the missions, since it had started 11 months earlier. And under his watch, 15 allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse were brought to the public's attention and brought to the UN's attention. The Secretary General said, enough. This is not the kind of leader we need. I'm going to make an example of him. I'm going to fire him, and then I'm going to call a meeting of all the heads of mission and all the force commanders and all the peacekeeping countries, read them the Riot Act. I'm going to make an example of Boubacar Guy. He replaced him with a man named Parfait Onanga Onyanga. He has been there for 6 months, and under his watch, there have been 28 allegations, and that man is still in his job. Not a single person has been fired since.
Paula, but now a question as a journalist, basically. How many people were brought into justice and not only repatriated in your account?
None.
Jane?
I mean, I don't even know, I don't even know how to answer your question in the sense of how many people were brought to justice. What are we talking about? I'm...
Well, yes, of those.
Yeah, no.
So, I'm sorry?
It's a big job, Jane.
Yeah, it's a big job. And, no one can do all that needs doing here. And, I listen very carefully to what people say. No UN staff knows the difference between sexual abuse of a child and abuse or sexual relation with a child. That's baloney. Abuse of a child is abuse of a child. There's not a single adult living that works at the UN that doesn't know it's wrong. It doesn't know it's wrong. It's wrong. I take very seriously this notion that people think that our rules and regulations are not a matter of public record. If that's the case, it should change. There shouldn't be anything about the rules and regulations of the United Nations that are secret. Our policies, our human resource policies should all be made public. And so I would be surprised to learn which of our policies dealing with human relations and dealing with the staff at the UN are not publicly available. I'll find out. That's something we have to deal with. I can't deal in theoretics. I can't deal in always or never. I have to deal in now, and I have to deal in pragmatic steps that cause our record to improve. Thursday of this week, on the front page of the Washington Post, is a full-length article about sexual exploitation and abuse in the United States Naval Academy. This is a problem that exists everywhere. I don't say that to excuse it. I want to know, where is best practice? We've spoken about, for example, re-victimizing victims. What a horrible thing. I mean, I say this personally, and I feel it deeply. 5 times interviewing young children. Okay, what's best practice? 5 seems a lot to me, too. What is best practice? No one knows. And if there are examples of best practice, there are examples of better practice. We want to know what they are. We want to put them in play. We want to prevent these things from happening to begin with before units deploy. Make it very clear we're going to take this very seriously. There's not a military commander in any of our troop contributing countries that don't know what accountability means. We want to put that in play. Within missions, we want a rapid response. We want visible signs of accountability and the potential for accountability, whether it's a legal officer or the existence of a tribunal or other measures. And we want to move the victim to the center of our efforts to eradicate this problem. People complain, just a final thought, that we take the rights of the perpetrators more seriously than we do the rights of the victims. It's true, the UN system does take the question of due process and rights of the accused seriously. But for this problem, the needs of the victim must come first.
Paula and Madeleine.
I just want to point out a very tangible lack of clarification. On page 31 of the Special Measures Report, which is the annual report that the Secretary General has to issue each year to the General Assembly, and in it, it has its special measures on progress towards the implementation of zero tolerance for sexual exploitation and abuse, and there are annexes in the back, and that's where we get these numbers of 69 allegations. So that's where those numbers came from the Friday before last. And on page 31, we've got one case in MINUSCA, the mission there, of a Burundian military person, and the charge is sexual activity with a minor. And then on the same page, we've got 2 military members who are accused of sexual assault of a minor. And my question is, if there are any people from the United Nations in the audience or anyone at all, can you tell me what the difference is between sexual assault of a minor and sexual activity with a minor? And which is more serious? Which one does the UN think should be punished more severely? Which one does the United Nations think should be referred for long sentences in jail? And which ones are simply activities with minors? I don't think anyone who works for the UN, who may be the people who made up this table, but certainly not the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of a more transparent United Nations who's dealing with this process, this problem, can possibly understand what the difference is between the sexual assault of a child and sexual activity with a child.
Well, I can tell you the difference, but I think that doesn't make your point. Your point is a much more powerful one. Assault is when you infringe on the personal space or person of an individual. And, most legal regimes would make that distinction. But your larger point is the much more important one, is that rather than become legalistic in the sense of we have a policy problem, we have a behavioral problem, we have an operational problem, and we're not deploying the law nearly as effectively as we can in a preventive way and a restorative way for victims, and we need to change that.
But Jane, is having sexual activity with a 12-year-old not an assault on a child?
Under most legal regimes, there's a distinction that's made. But your basic point is the right one. Yes, it's true. Yes, it is.
We could go on with semantics,
Madeleine,
but I think
yeah,
that the point is well taken, that basically any sexual activity with a child is illegal and an assault and must be prosecuted, and there should be the full force of law behind it. And in Bosnia, to my absolute horror, I found out after being there for 2 years that, in fact, on the advertisements that were going on the rounds through the internet, through the internal document, people, some of the American contingent who were actually, as we know now, hired by DynCorp, a private contractor but serving the United Nations, they were actually advertising where you could go and have sex with minors. Advertising. So there was a culture of men seeking out younger children, as we saw in the film. So I think that, it is wrong of us to think that most people think that that is wrong. I think I'm going to just contradict myself there. The majority of us do. Some think it's wrong. Some men will take advantage of children. The sad thing is, the rest of us are quiet. And this was the case in Bosnia. Some of it stems from a zero-tolerance policy, which is not defined sufficiently and not clear in what it actually means, because then you do blur the distinctions. You have a relationship with somebody from the domicile population, which you think is fine. You take your wedding ring off beforehand, and it continues. That, one thing. Then you have the extremities of the other sorts of abuse. But nobody is really quite sure how that policy was supposed to be interpreted. That then evolved over time to where we are now. But what it has meant was that because people weren't clear, because men weren't clear, there was a nod and a wink to any sort of sexual activity. So when in Bosnia there was trafficking, there was sexual exploitation of women and of children, the real obstacle to actually achieving anything was this conspiracy of silence, but I would actually put it down to the fear that men had of other men when they are part of an organized brigade, whether they be, we might call it the pack mentality. You're part of a contingent. If you don't do what the rest of the contingent do, or if you choose to tell tales, if you like, on your fellow members of that contingent, you are ostracized in a foreign land with no support. It's what we lads do on a Saturday night, and you better be part of it, because if you're not part of it, you're against us. And then, as a friend of mine was accused of being a homosexual, which is probably the worst thing you could ever be, not a paedophile, that doesn't matter, but a homosexual. So you get into these ridiculous scenarios where there's a conspiracy of silence about illegal activities which are being undertaken based on this ridiculous idea of male bonding around uniforms and about conduct. And that's because of the lack of clarity. And we saw it again and again. And what happened was, I've still got the testimonies of many guys who said they came forward, described what they'd seen, but wouldn't go any further because they were too scared. And they were probably the majority. But that's the sort of conduct, that's the sort of culture that I think the UN has to come to terms with in understanding how masculinities evolve and working with men to stop those. The contingents where there hasn't been abuse has been where there is strong leadership saying that is not how men should behave. That essentially, if you think you've got to have sex every 5 minutes, then you're not fit for purpose and must go home. How can you be on mission before you're thinking about having sex with someone? You've got a job to do. So I think that that is a very important messaging that comes from the top, and it can be made to work.
Thank you. Yeah, I will give you the floor, and then I'll open, actually, to questions.
I just wanted to reiterate Jane's question about what are best practices. That's the information that's missing. And the question beyond that is why, when we have Kofi Annan telling the public in 2006 that sexual abuse by peacekeepers is unacceptable and there is a policy of zero tolerance, and in 2016 we have the Secretary General using the same words about the same situation without real identifiable advance, why is it that we don't know what is necessary to bring about at least lower tolerance? But clearly there's been a decade of high tolerance. And all of these answers about what are best practices, they're not intuitive. You don't just write guidelines, which is what the United Nations seems to do. The guidelines are not based on some empirical facts from a real situation. One of the graphs in the Secretary General's report is progress toward shortening investigations. So the assumption is that expedited investigations are better. But we don't know that that's true. In fact, we have some cases where that's a way to conceal evidence and dismiss cases. So you really need, over 9 years, there was plenty of time to have people in these camps talking to the residents, to the soldiers, to the commanders, to find out what is the motivation and why do people do this and what would be necessary to end it.
So I'm going to disagree with this. 9 years is clearly not enough time. 200 years in many established militaries is not enough time. 2,000 years in the church is not enough time. So what are we going to do to eradicate this unacceptable behavior? We need to know, and we need all of us. We don't always agree on everything, but you bring important perspectives here that we need to hear in the UN. We don't have the luxury of wand waving. There's no swish and flick. If only we had better commanders. That's part of it, no question about it. We need better policies. We need accountability, and we need clarity in what the standards are. I agree with all of those things. And even then, we will have people who find ways to disagree. Short investigative periods, that brings some satisfaction to the victims or some sense to the victims that a process is in place. To those who are accused, it may feel like a bum's rush. So we have to pull together a workable policy that works. I mean, that will allow us to conduct operations and spread much more widely the best practice where we know this has not gone on.
I also think you...
Sorry, Paula, because of our time, I'm going to break my promise. I'm just going to give the word very briefly to Madeleine and then open to the floor so we can get the questions
Then
from
I will be super quick.
the
I was going to talk about how you can do an effective response, because we did do one in Bosnia that was effective, and I think this good practice can be learnt from that. It was undermined for different reasons. The one thing I think we haven't heard from Jane, and I know you won't have time to answer it, is the big elephant in the room is the whistleblower. Because that is where the information comes from. That is where we will know that the United Nations is serious about addressing it, is making sure the support for the men who are not indulging in crimes, it's support for those who expose the crimes, it's support for those who actually expose what is happening, as Anders Kompetz did, when they go to the member state and do their job, and not hounding them. Unless and until that happens, then I'm afraid we're not going to be able to have the transparency in the United Nations, which is going to lead to curing this really horrific crime that's being committed against children and women.
Thank you. Let's open to the public. Please, madam.
I worked in the Inspector General's office of one of the UN organisations. I have a couple of questions. Firstly, in relation to the large number of civilians that are actually responsible, Paula, could you give us some examples of what sort of measures should be put into place in order to deal with that problem more efficiently, since we know how poorly that's been dealt with? In relation to the Secretary-General's bulletin on preventing exploitation and abuse, Section 4 refers specifically to the role of managers, and when a manager fails to protect and fails to implement an environment in which sexual exploitation is prevented, that's also grounds for investigation and dismissal. In the case of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, when the very most senior manager fails to take action and in fact covers up that particular case, and the Secretary-General doesn't investigate, doesn't follow his own bulletin, where does the buck stop?
There are several things that the United Nations could do on the civilian side, and again, at least 30% of all these accusations are made against people who report ultimately to the Secretary-General. I think best practices are modeled. They're not preached, they're modeled. And so if the Secretary-General and the Secretariat were to say, do as I do, not as I say, and instead of saying to the troop contributing countries, why don't you insist on DNA samples so that we can establish paternity, and then you can go ahead and give rights to the people who who are trying to make child custody claims for these God knows how many peacekeeper babies who are all over the world. But what the Secretary General should say is, if you want the privilege of working for the United Nations, then you submit a DNA sample upon your, when you take the oath of office, and then if you are deployed to a peacekeeping mission, then we can make sure that if there's a child who's fathered and the victim wants to establish paternity, you'll be cleared of charges. Not that we're trying to get you, but we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you're not going to commit these crimes. The naming and shaming that's got given so much attention. For the first time this year, we're learning the names of the troop contributing countries whose soldiers and police officers have committed these crimes. But next to civilian, it says not applicable. So we don't have any idea. It's just some civilian among the tens of thousands of people who work for the United Nations. Some civilian was accused of one of these, an allegation was made against some civilian. There's no way that that's naming and shaming. At least, at the very least, the agencies should be named and shamed. It should say UNICEF, Office of the High Commission for Human Rights. When we get to the question of UNICEF and the other agencies, when they do wrong, when they interview children in the Central African Republic, and then they claim, when this becomes public, when UNICEF claims publicly to the member states and to the world, we took care of those children, every single child was given medical and psychosocial support, they came to us, they looked to us for help, and when they told us about their horrific rapes at the hands of French peacekeepers, and peacekeepers from Chad and Equatorial Guinea, we gave them support, we put them in protective environments, and we gave them medical and psychosocial support. And then a panel, an expert panel, goes to the Central African Republic, finds those children again, and tries to find the people, the NGOs, the local NGOs who are supposedly providing this support, and they find out zero support was given. In total, the 9 children that UNICEF claimed publicly that it had provided support for were interviewed for a total, a cumulative 2 hours, and then sent back into the IDP camp to be on their own, and at least 2 of them were raped again. So if there isn't accountability that's being modeled as a best practice at the top, if there isn't sort of an absolute obsession with making sure that before you preach to the troop contributing countries and to the member states what the highest standards should be and what they should be doing to fix their problem, you look at your third of the problem and make sure that you're putting all those best practices in place first, and then say, do as I do.
Yeah, I just wanted to relay an anecdote about one case we saw where it was very clear that the manager, the commanding officer, was not enforcing discipline, and the result was chaos and widespread sexual abuse of children. It was in Haiti, and there were a group of children living in an abandoned house, and they were parentless, they had no guardians, they had no support, and they had been, our investigator found they had been given cell phones by soldiers who called them to go through a hole in the wall of the base, which was readily visible, to provide sexual services. So the investigator took the phone numbers that these children had on their cell phones, their burner phones, and he asked the commanding officer to line the troops up and ask them to put their cell phones on a table across the yard, which they did. And then he began to call the numbers the children had given him. And the phones rang, and the instruction was, when your phone rings, go pick it up. And so then you had identified the perpetrators, except that at a certain point, there was a ringing phone in the pocket of the commanding officer. And he said, oh, it's personal, I'll call back. So when you have someone in charge like that, how can you possibly, this is something I want to emphasize, how can you possibly have any discipline? But more than that, it's not that hard to find out. That's what I really want to say. It's not that hard to know what's wrong. When you have a situation like Anders Compass, where the High Commissioner for Human Rights tells the report, the disclosing staff member who went to the appropriate mission which went to law enforcement with evidence of crimes, asks him to resign for violating the confidentiality of the children. That is preposterous. How can the organization function like that? And I was looking at some of the solutions that have been proposed based on, I don't know what kind of research or evidence, but in the Secretary General's report, I think it's his report, there's talk about rolling out an e-training program for troops about to deploy, and this program will be mandatory for all troops to take. Now, I think it would be useful to know whose idea that was, based on what, how much does it cost, and why are we doing that instead of something perhaps more effective?
Could I just jump in on the issue about the High Commissioner? Because I think this is very important, because the Central African Republic has been the latest in the biggest, most recent scandals, because it's gone all the way to the top. We said we need to have command responsibility. We need for senior management to be seen to be doing something. And at the moment, we do have this issue with the High Commissioner. We, I think, collectively would all have an awful lot more confidence in the promises of the United Nations if the High Commissioner would publicly apologize to Anders Kompass and actually say that he now knows that what he did was incorrect, inappropriate, and he stands by the decision of his senior manager.
I want to come back to what P said, criticizing this e-learning. I've spent almost 40 years in public service. And what you realize, it's, from the outside looking in, it's a real hole in the donut exercise. If we didn't use something like technology, if we didn't have pre-deployment training, if we didn't make it mandatory, we'd be criticized for not taking advantage of the fact that everybody has a cell phone. This is an era where we can use technology and deploy it to the good. The point is that it's not the best possible solution. It might be the minimum necessary. We've got a long way to go. We recognize that. My job, the charge that I've been given, is to take all of the good ideas that are in play, both with respect to the car panels report, which the Secretary General has broadly accepted those, and ensure that the system implements them and makes progress in a way that people can measure and see. Will it be perfect? No. Will we all agree that the UN is now the model of best practice? Maybe not. But the challenge, again, is not to just say, this won't work, this won't work, this won't work, but to pool the collective experience that we have, where there are good examples. Maybe they didn't work in Bosnia 25 years ago. But I'm a real believer that every good idea whose time has come began as an idea ahead of its time. And maybe we have the conditions now. The notion of mandatory DNA testing is not new. We discussed this in 2004 and 2005. There's a longer conversation about why things are possible under some conditions and not others. There's a longer practical conversation. There are no glib answers. I'm not going to sit here and sort of whip out some clever response. There's a lot of reasons that it didn't happen. Maybe it can happen now. And I accept also the point that, beginning with the UN staff, there are a number of things we can do. The charge from the Secretary General is to do what we can do and begin it immediately. And then there are other things that the member states say, whoa. You need to check with us first before you start doing any of this. The answer is we don't have to check with the member states for everything, and we've already begun, as the Secretary General report reflects.
Can I just say that I think that if e-learning and a 2-week session on why not to sexually exploit or abuse vulnerable people were effective, it would be mandatory in our shared country in every school in the United States. If that was the way to solve this problem that you say exists everywhere.
No magic wands.
But there has to be, in the United Nations, there's a standard that says that before you spend billions of dollars on something and use that as sort of the proof that you're preventing sexual abuse by soldiers who are, being deployed all over the world to work among the world's most vulnerable people, you have to figure out whether e-learning really is going to be effective, and I don't think there's any proof that it will be. But as far as the transparency goes, You've just said, and I'm glad to hear this, that the Secretary General has broadly accepted the recommendations of the CAR panel. And transparency requires that when an expert independent panel tables their report to the public on December 17th, and it contains 12 recommendations, that the world hear from the Secretary General. I like number 1, I'm implementing number 2, I like number 3, I have problems about number 4. We haven't heard anything, and we also don't know who's in charge of implementing those recommendations. I have heard that some of the same people who are named in that CAR panel report as having offended the population in the Central African Republic and their colleagues are now leading the charge and implementing those 12 recommendations. But transparency really has to start at the top. You have to say to the Secretary General, you have been read a riot act. You've been told by this independent expert group that you have a systemic failure, and we have 12 recommendations. It is incumbent upon the leader of the United Nations to respond to that publicly rather than doing it behind closed doors.
I guess we have a question from the floor.
Oui, merci, mesdames. Le débat, c'était soldat, violeur ou protecteur. Je vais prendre le point de vue du soldat, puisque je suis général de l'armée de terre, à la retraite, et non pas en retraite. La préposition est importante, ça a une connotation qui peut être mal vue. En ce qui concerne ma réaction, vous avez expliqué au niveau de l'ONU, je trouve qu'à l'ONU, tout est en place. D'accord. Comme quoi, c'est pas facile de communiquer. Hein. Il me semble qu'à l'ONU, tout est en place. J'ai vu les manuels, etc. J'ai regardé dans tous les sens. Je ne représente que moi-même, ce qui permet de me dire ce que je pense.
Already is in place, and so this allows me to say everything.
Dans l'armée de la
In the French army, you have also everything in place, all the legal system and the sanction system, the criminal system is also put in place. Though the accused has been sentenced to 9 years of prison. So it took a long time to be sentenced. Why? This is my first question. And secondly, you have been talking about from the top, but I'm talking from the lower level, so of course you have all the managers and all the commanders, but then you have the whole hierarchy which has to be made accountable. So if you are lieutenant, and when there is an investigation to sort out the responsibilities, when you are on the fields, everybody knows what is going on, so there is no excuse for not acting. Every time you have to catch the person, the perpetrator, the person who committed a crime. So I'm going to give you a short anecdote. When I was engaged in the Gulf, an officer came to see me and he told me, "Oh, I hope you are soon going to be in Iraq to loot and to rape." So I told him, if you steal something, it's okay, I don't mind. But if you rape somebody, I kill you. I'm not sure I would have done it, but I can tell you that another guy was saying something. She said, no, you don't say that, because the colonel is not kidding with this issue. So the boss has a very important part to play at the highest level. And then second thing I would like to say, I would like the people to go from this room thinking that all the soldiers of the UN peacekeeping mission are criminals. But you have known a boy called Eric Ardois, Ricardo and he was trying to protect young people who were sitting in place containers. He was trying to protect them from snipers, and he died in '95. I'd just like to add something. If you have the opportunity to hear the song of Sarajevo sung by Trian, so it's a beautiful thing, so please don't condemn the soldier as a whole, but a commander has to take his responsibility. He is not a culprit, but he is responsible for that. And so very often people say it's Africa. No, it's not Africa. It's the whole world. You have citizens. The integrity of person, respect of human dignity is something which is the belief of a soldier. And if the soldier is not able to do so, so he has to quit the army and to do something else. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, sir. Does anyone want to react to this statement, or should we get a last question from the floor? Last question from the floor.
Good evening. We have heard now a lot about finding the responsible persons in the system, and I just wanted to bring it from the aspect of the victim. What do the women, as we have seen, it's already now 10 years ago that this film was done, and what has been done for the victims, and what could the UN do for such victims? Is there anything foreseen in terms of compensation, help? Has it been done, and is it foreseen in the future? That's my question.
I can't speak to the disposition of these cases in the intervening 10 years. What I can tell you is the Secretary General, in his recent remarks, have called for the establishment of a trust fund for victims' assistance, and a number of other measures are underway to really to emphasize the needs of the victims first in these cases. Yes, we want to be mindful of due process for the accused. But far more important, we think, is putting the needs of the victims first. A single sexual assault destroys many, many, many lives, and we have to address that. So there are explicit things under my responsibility to coordinate that are designed to strengthen the system's response to victim needs.
To end this debate, I would like each one of you to actually set out what should be the first priority for next week, probably, if we don't have to wait for states. What can we do immediately, or what is it being done already immediately to deal with this?
Well, of course, I would say that we have to implement very effectively the whistleblower protection policy at the United Nations throughout the UN, not just the Secretariat and Peacekeeping, but in UNICEF, UNESCO, UNDP, all of the agencies and specialized agencies, funds, and programs. The record on protecting whistleblowers at the UN is abysmal. And of course, the cases that are most visible because of Anders Compass this past year are cases coming from peacekeeping. But people reveal corruption, fraud, illegality, abuse, etc., and they are the ones who leave the system, and the perpetrator lives on to flourish another day.
There's no flourishing for perpetrators as far as I'm concerned. You asked for one set of priorities. I've got one hand, I've got 5 fingers, so I'm going for 5. Good. We're going to prioritize ways to prevent this behavior from happening. We do want to model best practice. We want to know why it works. I mean, I was a soldier for a long time. I'm married to a soldier. I understand life in the military. I understand the accountability of a commander. You're responsible for everything your unit does and fails to do. And down to the unit commander level, you're carrying the buck. You're carrying the buck. So we need to do what we can to send that message across very clearly. We'll do it in concert with member states. As I mentioned, we've asked at a minimum for their military rules and regulations that govern their forces at all times, 24 hours a day, wherever they are on the planet, including when they're in peacekeeping missions. We want to get them, we want to make them public so everyone knows what rules those troops are subject to. We want to reduce the potential for this to exist in missions for our civilian staff, and not just in peacekeeping, but across the UN system and across all the agencies that operate under a UN mandate when they deploy to the field. That includes non-UN organizations as well. That will require a collaboration, but we are prioritizing the prevention and the reduction of possibility. In missions, we want to in place the kinds of tools that facilitate early reporting of these things, that tear down the veils of transparency that exist, and they do exist. B, asked the question, you know, what kind of commander is it that has a cell phone that's ringing in his own pocket? He's a lousy commander. He ought to be fired. And there ought to be no ambiguity about it. Now, there's a process that every military officer can follow for redress that's appropriate, but under those circumstances, and every military knows it, it's unambiguous. You're derelict in your duty, and you ought to pay the immediate price. So we need to in place in missions mechanisms that make it easy to report these abuses, give aid and assistance to victims, and demonstrate wherever possible accountability. You know, I find it's kind of interesting. When I travel around, if you're in Delhi and you pick up the Delhi Times, what do you read? You read that so-and-so was accused of an assault on a street at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And whatever details you know about the person who was accused of the assault, they're put in the newspaper, where they might work, where they live. If you pick up a newspaper here in Geneva and there's a report of an alleged crime, you see the person who's alleged to have done the crime. Where do they live? Where did they work? That's kind of interesting. You see it in every city around the world. Why don't we see it in every peacekeeping mission around the world at a minimum? Yes, these allegations are serious, but it's in part we need to bring more visibility to the fact that higher expectations are imposed on peacekeepers because we are sent to protect. We must be fit to protect.
Paula.
I changed mine.
Yeah.
There are a million things that need to be done. All of them need to be done tomorrow. All of them need to be done yesterday. I'm going to take you up on your suggestion, or what sounded almost like a suggestion, Jane. And I think, again, the Secretariat needs to model the behavior that it is recommending to the troop contributing countries. So tomorrow, we don't need a Security Council resolution to do this. We don't need the permission of member states. The Secretariat should say, every person who works for the United Nations who is accused of sexually abusing anyone on a peacekeeping mission will have their photograph plastered in the UN News or wherever it is. But let's have that sort of transparency that we're suggesting for the troop contributing countries. Let's have that within the United Nations itself. And on top of that, the Secretary General can say tomorrow, tomorrow's Sunday, we'll give him till Monday, that there will be absolute and complete transparency coming from him and his office and his entire staff starting on Monday. If a journalist asks a question and the answer would not either obstruct due process, obstruct justice, or compromise global security, then the Secretary General promises that we will get the answers. We, the peoples, make up the United Nations, and there is absolutely no reason for this shroud of silence that creates and fosters and aids and abets and enables the culture of impunity. So if Jamil, as a journalist, wants to know, will the High Commissioner for Human Rights ever be sanctioned for the activities that he took, for vilifying a staff member who has now been completely exonerated by the United Nations, or will he continue to serve as the High Commissioner and get public platforms all over the world where he can look like a hero for human rights, but behind closed doors seems to be acting like anything but a hero? Will he be sanctioned and disciplined by the Secretary General? Then because that doesn't obstruct anybody's due process or compromise global security, then the Secretary General, according to the promise he's going to make on Monday, will say, I'm going to answer you, Jamil, because you're a journalist and we, the peoples, have the right to know.
Thank you. Madeleine, you have the last word.
Right, I get the last word. Well, I agree with all of the above, because I think that all of that is absolutely vital. And I think possibly the most important thing the United Nations can and must do is to stop being so obsessed with itself that it forgets what it's there for. It is not the institution, it is not the institutions and the people within the institution, it is the people it is there to protect and serve. And therefore, if we remember that and hold the UN accountable for that, the people in the UN system must be the ones who are cognizant, aware, and acting at all times on that. And if that promise is actually delivered, then in 5 years' time we won't be having this conversation.
Excellent. With this note, and actually with the mentioning of the role of the victim and basically what is being done regarding the victim, I just want to tell a very short story just to end this conversation. Some years ago, I went to Africa for a book, and in Côte d'Ivoire, I was having breakfast with a man, older guy, very gentle, very, I would say, wise, and he was telling me that actually he only went to school at one point of his life because the UN existed. He was a boy in a country that was at war, and that country, not only during wartime, was impossible to go to school, but when the war finished, the schools were destroyed. And he remembers, and he was trying to tell this story in a very emotional way, how the fact that actually he only could go to school because the UN existed. And he was telling how, for example, one of the classrooms was underneath a tree. That country was South Korea, and that boy was Ban Ki-moon. Now, if we think, and I don't want to push it, what if he didn't get lucky? What if he didn't get lucky? And this goes back to the issue of the victim. This, just to finish the story, but as you said, putting the peoples in the middle and not the UN itself. Thank you very much.